Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythologies. We just cracked open a delicious Rheingeist knowledge. I normally drink my Rheingeist Truth, but Rheingeist knowledge is 8.5% alcohol. It has a hoppier flavor, and it is delicious. And that's going to be the fuel for this episode today. So, what are we talking about on today's episode, you might ask? Well, we are diving into a form of hidden knowledge, also known as divination. And once again, we're hitting a subject that encompasses all cultures on this planet, and it goes back as far as the earliest humans to walk the face of this earth. It really starts with these old shamanistic practices in prehistory, and it goes all the way through to the modern day. If you've ever walked around a city and you saw that neon light that says Madam What's-Her-Face's palmistry or fortune telling or whatever, and you ever actually walked into that shop and listened to whatever she has to say, you're part of this cultural practice that goes back to the pre-dawn of history. And since we're starting at the pre-dawn of history, I guess that's the beginning. So let's get into it. So pretty much as far back as humans formed little groups and was wandering around this planet, there's almost probably always been some elder in the group or some person just who has some specific knowledge of some plants or stars or whatever, who takes on that role of the shaman, the mystic. Eventually it would form into religious priests and stuff. And these characters with this specific knowledge, it kind of existed on the fringe of the group. Within the group, you'd have your warrior, and then you'd have your healer or whatever, and you'd have the little children and your hunters and whatever. But there would always be this shaman type character, and everybody would go to the shaman type character because that character was going to be the one who was going to predict whether or not the next hunt was successful, or whether or not it was safe to go into that valley because you might get attacked by another tribal group or whatever. And this shaman, he would be, or she would be, employing some kind of ritual that they created in order to determine the answer to these questions about your future. And that leads into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of different shamanistic practices that would lead to all these divination practices, i.e. casting bones or using astrology. It would eventually morph into astrology, which to a lot of people for a long time was considered a science. It would morph into something as simple as casting dice and how the dice fell. That would determine your fate. Or it would eventually morph into tarot or palm reading or whatever other little trick that you would use to divine the future. Tea leaf reading and staring into the crystal ball, or there are just so many others. I could go on for days, but I digress. But at the end of the day, despite all the techniques and styles and whatever of divining the future, that's literally what divination is. It's trying to figure out what's going to happen in the immediate future. And this does permeate all human cultures because humans, we naturally tend to always think about the future. And we're always a little bit anxious about our own future, especially if we're going to embark on some kind of endeavor which may jeopardize our future. So it's kind of a way of mentally ensuring that our future is kind of in our hands, that the events that we're going to partake in are going to be in our best interests. It's just like all the oracles of ancient Greece, the most famous one being the Oracle of Delphi. That was basically divination. People would go to her and ask, hey, is my crop going to do good? Hey, am I going to do well on this military expedition or whatever? And, usually the answer would be kind of ambiguously worded because you don't want to tell a general that he's going to that he's going to do terrible in this military endeavor, or that he's going to win in this military endeavor, and then he ends up losing and then comes back and he, has a vengeance against you. So they keep it a little ambiguously worded. But, that ambiguous wording, that's kind of the theater behind that, because you're basically saying, I don't know, in a clever way. However, you do it in such a clever way that the person feels good about taking on the endeavor, or they learn a valuable life lesson and they don't feel good about taking on the endeavor and they don't do it. But as many techniques and styles and all of the types of divination there are, the answers to many of these questions that are asked, and to be honest, the questions themselves really only boil down to maybe 10, maybe 15 different questions that all humans ask. It's kind of universal. The answers being yes, no, I don't know, and maybe. And the questions being general questions about life and success. The number one question that if you go to any psychic or palm reader or whatever, the number one question is going to be, am I going to be successful in either this endeavor or life? That's probably the number one thing. And generally the rest of the questions are basic universal things like, for example, if you're a farmer, will my crop be successful? That probably was the number one question when 90% of us were farmers. And of course, in today's world, I bet the number one question a lot of these diviners, or I guess you can call them psychics here, is, am I going to be rich and famous? Is my YouTube channel going to blow up? Or is my podcast going to actually make money after this episode? That's probably the number one thing they hear now, especially in the United States. But, they're also having to answer other general life questions. Is my father going to get over this illness? Or whatever happened to Billy after he was eaten by that bear? Is he happy in the afterlife or the next life? Or who was I in my past lives? It all boils down to like the same 10 questions, and no matter what method you're using to divine, if you can basically get the gist of those 4 answers, yes, no, maybe, I don't know, and if you can get a handle on basically those 10 or 15 questions, you're probably going to make it as a so-called psychic or diviner. And you can't see me because it's all audio, but I am using the air quotes. And in a lot of cases, especially the case of like Billy who was eaten by a bear, the answer is going to be, of course, he's happier in his next life or in the afterlife, because my God, he was eaten by a bear in this one. He's got to be happier in the next one. But I digress. So what's really funny about the art of divination or psychic reading or palm reading or astrology or whatever is it doesn't really exist within the context of any religion. It always exists as kind of this secret knowledge on the outside of a religion, or this weird ritual on the outside of a religious practice. We never see it in mainstream religion, and I think that's just kind of a human thing, because let's say you're a Christian and the art of palm reading, for example, or tarot, it doesn't exist in your Christian religion or your Buddhist religion or Islam or Judaism or whatever. It doesn't really exist in that religion, although this practice, this ceremony or whatever you want to call it, this divination practice, it's existed in history throughout the ages, and it's always somebody who kind of seems like they're kind of outside of that religion that you're used to in your life that you go to for these answers. Or a lot of people just do it today for entertainment, but in the past they would do it for real answers on real endeavors. And it's actually kind of weird because you see a lot of corporate executives, especially in the financial industry, which is the industry I actually work in with my day job. They'll actually consult horoscopes and psychics to see if their investments are going to be good. but it kind of falls in this superstitious realm outside of mainstream religion. It's really fascinating, and I guess it alludes to the fact that even though we can tie ourselves into certain religious practices, unless you're like an atheist or agnostic like myself, I don't subscribe to any religious practice, but as a human, I am generally superstitious about a few things, so I could see why that would exist outside that confine of a religion. But I guess the point I'm jumping around is the divination, it really does exist outside of mainstream religion. It kind of falls in that realm of the supernatural or the superstitious, and it's in that realm where it really thrives as its own thing. And it's kind of cool because since there's no like codified method, it's really freeform and really open to your own interpretation. It's kind of a lot like jazz. You just kind of get into the groove and go. And while there are a few like general systems and general rules as to, this is how you read these tarot cards, or this is how the astrology works, or whatever, like I said, it's really free form and open to interpretation by both the mystic who is performing the ceremony and the person who is receiving the information. And even in things like astrology or tarot, I keep coming back to those two, or palm reading, those do have codified universal systems that kind of everybody agrees with. However, even in those systems, the interpretation is extremely loose. And some people, especially in like palm reading, you can literally just make up stuff. As long as you're convincing and believable, you're going to entertain your audience, or you're going to inform your audience. And if you give them the answers they want to hear, or if you actually use it to give them some sound actual advice in life, they want to take on an endeavor that seems insane, and you kind of cleverly find a way to talk them out of it, because they'll lose their shirt if they embark on that endeavor. You could pretty much make it up as you go. There's actually a guy I met one time who, he's a magician, but he learned how to do palm reading at parties by basically making it up and reading a book on the general practice. And he says that you can pretty much interpret whatever you want. A lot of it uses cold reading, which I'll get into later, but you can pretty much make it up. And as long as you're keeping that person entertained, engaged, and they're listening to what you're saying, you're basically winning at the whole process. And I think that's another reason why people are attracted to these practices. Not only is it because it's kind of mystic and almost goth-like and awesome and fun, it's good entertainment, but it's because they're getting the responses that they want to hear. They're getting that positive feedback most of the time, or sometimes it's negative feedback, but it's feedback that they have to hear. And it makes them feel more comfortable about the future, which, like I said earlier, humans were basically very anxious about the future. And the whole point of divination is to kind of quell that anxiety about the future. If we can go into a situation thinking that we're going to win or that we're going to have a better chance, then it's more attractive than going into a situation completely blind. And as we know, no one wants to go into a situation completely blind. So with that all out of the way, let's just kind of riff on some stuff that we see in like modern divination and some of the more well-known practices such as palm reading, tarot, astrology, hell, even the magic 8-ball. Yes, if you've ever had a magic 8-ball and you've asked it questions, that's basically divination. But I digress. So the most common thing you will see if you ever like actually go into one of those Madame Laveau's or whatever, it's always some weird semi-French sounding Cajun name, mystical palm reading or psychic shops, is you'll see a crystal ball generally, and you'll see a set of tarot cards. And the crystal ball, to be honest, is really only there for theater purposes. Now, there are some people who will employ a crystal ball and they'll stare into the facets and the inclusions and stuff within the crystal, and based on that, they'll come up with some interpretation. But generally, they're just making it up. Now, the tarot cards, there's thousands of different types of tarot cards out there in different decks and different systems, but generally they'll have a certain system in place, and they'll use those systems to give you general ideas to kind of prod you into the direction you want to go into, because these people, what they're doing is they're doing cold reading. They're not actually discerning information from these cards. They're discerning information from you. And this is called cold reading, and this is how they do it. So cold reading is essentially discerning knowledge from rapid fire question asking and looking at your body language, how you carry yourself, how you answer the questions, and even like physical characteristics on your body to glean information about you. A lot of mentalists, psychics, magicians, whatever, they all use the art of cold reading because it's their way of really getting inside your head, getting some of that intimate knowledge that they can use in order to better entertain you in their craft. And most of these people today, especially in today's world, they're entertainers. They're there to entertain you. It's theater. It's their job. So they might as well be good at it. They're not out to actually con you. Now, there are a few people out there who are actually out to con others, and those people are assholes. But most people, they'll say up front, this is for entertainment purposes. It's all theater. Take from it what you will. But they're all employing this art of cold reading. And, let's say you go in for a palm reading and they're looking at your palm and they see you have like calloused hands and dirty torn fingernails and stuff. They might infer that, hey, this is a person who works with his hands, probably with tools or whatever. And, it's going to discern their social class. They're going to look at the way they're dressed. It's going to determine various things about their social class, their mentality, whatever. And from that, they're going to take that idea while rapid fire asking all these crazy questions, which the questions, they're very general, and then they get slightly more specific. They start out general, then they get more specific based on the answers, because a lot of these people that are doing this, especially for a living, they're actually very intelligent. They're very good at reading people and interpreting what people say and how they dress and stuff. And they can get down to that focal point and they can answer the questions that you want to hear the answers to your liking. And that's kind of the whole point. And it's commonly said that you would be amazed how much information a person can discern from you just by paying attention to your mannerisms or the way you're dressed, or, certain distinctive marks on your body. You can tell a whole life story about somebody. Some of these people are so good, they can tell you your whole life story without even speaking to you. And while to a lot of people that may seem supernatural or insane, it's really just the fact that they are really good at discerning certain things about you just based on appearance alone. And that's really the gist of the whole art of cold reading. If you can rapid fire general questions and then get down to specifics, and if you can interpret essentially data from the person that you're so-called doing the psychic reading on, then you can entertain them for a while, make them think that you're a psychic or a mystic or whatever. And they might be inclined to listen to whatever you're rambling about. Everything else, the cards, the systems, the crystal ball, all that stuff, that's all just theater. It's just like how a musician gets you to look over here or think about this while he's actually doing stuff over here. It's all theater at the end of the day. But it really comes back to the fact that anybody that's good at it, they basically just know that those 4 answers, yes, no, maybe, or I don't know, and those 10 general questions that everybody has about their lives, like I said earlier, once you discern that and you can be able to answer that to a person's liking, you're going to be very successful at doing that, if for entertainment purposes or for career purposes or whatever. But it all kind of loops back around because historically, a lot of this stuff was considered science, it was considered truth. And I'm sure historically that a lot of these shamans and practitioners of this stuff who were like learning it from previous generations, this handed down knowledge, they probably truly believed in that. And I'm sure a lot of them did. And, there are also charlatans as well. However, it all kind of derives from that simple idea, that human idea of, what does my future hold? Which goes back as far as the earliest humans. And while I don't want to diminish cultural practices that have been around since the pre-dawn of history, or say that they're all bunk, or they were all being conned, or it was all cold reading, I'm not trying to say that at all. I'm saying it's funny how that practice kind of evolved throughout time and evolved into the theater and the cold reading what we have today, because we live in a more scientific minded world as opposed to a more superstitious world. But it is kind of fascinating how those superstitions have made it into today's culture and will be around with us probably until the last human, takes his last breath, whenever our species goes extinct. But I'm sure that as long as humans are around, we're gonna have things like astrology and throwing bones on the ground and reading tarot cards, because stuff like that just never goes away. It can be debunked, it could be said that it's all superstition and nonsense, but at the end of the day, we as humans were always looking for, I guess, that supernatural edge. Even if you're an atheist, you gotta admit that sometimes maybe you're looking for that little edge, that supernatural edge that makes you a little less anxious about life. Because let's face it, no one's truly logical about every little thing. But on that note, I think this is where I'll wrap things up. I'll be honest, this was like my 4th attempt at recording this episode. It's such a vast amount of information and different things that I couldn't quite possibly put everything I wanted to in this episode. I might in future episodes deep dive into some of these systems and some of these divination techniques and some of the histories behind it, because this thing's so vast it makes the Bigfoot episodes that I'm recording look minuscule by comparison. But I guess in this one I just wanted to do kind of a brief overview of the whole idea of divination and how it impacts our culture and how it impacts us as humans in our day-to-day life. So maybe I'll do some actual episodes into like the history of tarot and how it evolved, or the history of astrology and how it evolved, or palm reading and how that became a thing, or the oracles of ancient Greece and even Rome and other various cultures. Maybe I'll do like separate episodes on those. But for now, this is just a very general, brief overview. I guess it's kind of an introduction to a whole bunch of other subjects that I would like to get into, I think would be fun. And speaking of future episodes, if you do like what I'm doing, I always ask that you share my links, spam your friends' inboxes with them, send them like actual episodes that you think are interesting, or if you want, you can donate to me. There's a link on my Spotify. You can actually send me money. I would actually greatly appreciate that. It might help me update some equipment. Because speaking of needing to update equipment, I don't know if a lot of people have noticed, but I have had some feedback that there's a distinctive echo in a lot of my most recent episodes. Part of that's because I'm in like my 3rd studio since I have started this project, and the sound in this room just bounces off the walls. It's so echoey in here. But I am working on that as well, and hopefully future episodes won't have that distinctive echo. But once again, as always, I do thank you for listening. I will see you in the next episode.